He will. Good morning, and welcome to our webinar entitled Danger Zone, Work in the Higher Ed Science Lab. My name is Barry Kogut, and I'm an attorney with the law firm of Bond, Schoeneck King, where I have concentrated my practice in the area of environmental law since the mid-1980s. Joining me today is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Shannon McGarry, an environmental scientist who is a principal and vice president of the environmental consulting firm of Colden Corporation. Among her many academic credentials, and I invite you to review her bio, Dr. McGarry holds a Doctor of Science in Environmental Health from Harvard University with a concentration in occupational epidemiology. Shannon and I have conferred previously about our mutual concern over protecting the teachers and students who work in science labs at higher education institutions because they come into contact with materials that pose potential health and safety and environmental concerns. We therefore thought that it would be helpful to present this webinar to share our thoughts on how to maximize safety and minimize risk in working in a higher ed science lab. Our objectives are to provide a summary of the legal framework of both the health and safety and waste management requirements, and then suggest some best practices to maximize safety and minimize risk from both a personal protection and a regulatory compliance perspective. After the presentations, we'll have time for questions and answers, and ask that you type them in the Q&A box that is set forth on your screen. These questions will be answered after the webinar by email if we exceed the 1 hour allotted for the webinar. Let's start with the health and safety framework. And of course, from a health and safety perspective, that means starting with OSHA and its requirements. The most significant one is going to be the one dealing with occupational exposure to hazardous chemicals in laboratories, 29 CFR 1910.1450. That's where one has to develop a chemical hygiene plan and identify someone who is to serve as a chemical hygiene officer. OSHA defines a chemical hygiene officer as an employee who is designated by the employer and who is qualified by training or experience to provide technical guidance in the development and implementation of the provisions of the chemical hygiene plan. This definition is not intended to place limitations on the position description or job classification that the designated individual shall hold within the employer's organizational structure. Shannon, from your perspective, how would you describe the required qualifications for a chemical hygiene officer?
So you got the technical ones down. They've obviously got to be well versed by training and experience. And I think in the higher ed setting, a good chemical hygiene officer, an effective chemical hygiene officer, is one who's got some really good soft skills, so who can work collaboratively, who's not afraid, boots on the ground, to be out in the labs talking with folks, who's really viewed by principal investigators as someone that's going to help them, a collaborator.
So that obviously a very important position and very important component in chemical hygiene plan. But there are obviously a number of other OSHA standards that need to be observed. We have the hazard communication standard, where you're going to be dealing with your safety data sheets, bloodborne pathogens, personal protective equipment that Shannon will discuss in a little bit more detail in her remarks, eye and face protection, respiratory protection, hand protection, control of hazardous energy, your lockout, tagout requirements, and these are the standards that one needs to be familiar with. Now, OSHA covers private sector workplaces. The citation you see there is to an OSHA publication which identifies those states that have plans approved by OSHA where they have requirements for both public and private employees. Some states have a component that just deals with the public sector picking up the OSHA requirements, and in New York, that's done under our New York Public Employee and Safety and Health, or PESH Act, and this covers a public sector workplace. The details of the scope of that approval and the variations noted can be found looking at that August 16, 2006 Federal Register. Health and safety legal obligations. OSHA and the Chemical Hygiene Plan is going to protect employees, but not students. On the student side, the concern for the higher ed institution is ensuring that they have provided the required level of instruction for the students who work in the lab. If not, and there's a problem, an accident, then they have a potential lawsuit based upon common law liability with the allegation that they were negligent in terms of providing the necessary level of instruction. So now I'm going to switch this over to Shannon to get into some of the details of environmental health and safety management. Shannon?
Thank you, Barry, and thank you all for taking some time out of your busy schedules to join us this morning. I love this pictogram here. Barry asked me to do the impossible, which was summarize the top 5 health concerns in higher ed labs in 20 minutes. So I said, okay, Barry, I'll get right on that. But I want to start by saying that these issues are near and dear to my heart, both as an educator and an environmental health and safety professional. I spent over 10 years in chemistry and biology labs and a vivarium, and enjoyed every minute of it, and I want to make sure that these environments are as safe as possible for our scientists, including our budding and training scientists. So this guy all slumped over is great, because I can honestly say that I have never had a higher ed client say to me, wow, Shannon, I have everything under control, and I am well-staffed and funded to meet the challenges we face. So, you got scarce resources, but higher ed, I have to say on reflection, is one of the most difficult environments that we work on as health and safety professionals. Other than television and major motion movie production where you've got people doing stunts, purposely trying to put themselves in harm's way, I think higher ed is probably one of the most variable and changing environments that we work in. By definition, researchers are supposed to be doing new and different and challenging things every day. So I'm going to do my best to get to the top 5 areas of concern. They largely correlate with the top 10 most cited OSHA standards in higher ed by OSHA. There's some discrepancy when you look at the SIC codes on OSHA between the reporting in higher ed as a whole and the reporting of higher ed citations just in the laboratory spaces. But suffice it to say that hazard communication, lockout, tagout, PPE, and accident investigation are at the top of the higher ed labs for citations year after year. The list rarely changes. And we'll touch on those in some detail as I go through my top 5. But this list here is, a little bit of a step removed from those citations, but if these 5 items were routinely and adequately covered, shored up, addressed, functioning on all cylinders, I believe we'd have 0 incidents and illness and injury as a result of working in a lab. So my list starts with safety culture. It's seems to be one of those buzzwords, but I'm here to tell you it really is everything. It is just absolutely foundational. In different environments it means different things, but it's sort of one of those know it when you see it. It's an unfortunate way, but the best definition I ever heard of safety culture goes something like this. Safety culture is defined by what people do when no one is watching. And I'll share some more thoughts on that in a minute. And then I want to talk about the hazard and risk assessment process and how important that is, and how it marries so nicely with standard operating procedures, really getting those written up and functioning. I'll touch on the importance of a near miss and an incident reporting system, and I'll finish up with chemical management strategies as a really important compliance nugget, and that'll marry nicely with what Barry's got on the dock. So, creating a safety culture, what does that mean? How do you do that? It just seems like such a diffuse objective. But, I'm here to say that safety just can't be a priority. Priorities change, right? Safety and health have got to be woven into the fabric of an institution. It just has to become indistinguishable from operations. It becomes a consideration as much as do I have the right equipment? Do I have the right chemicals? The question, how am I going to do this safely, is just part of moving forward on a daily basis. And sitting where I sit with sort of a really broad view of various business sectors, I can say it happens, and when it does, it's awesome. It's phenomenal. So throughout the presentation, I put some links in. You can see one here from the American Chemical Society. These should be hot linked, but if they're not, just highlight and paste it into the browser. This is a web link to the American Chemical Society's homepage for their Committee on Chemical Safety. There's some great guideline documents in here. There's some great teaching materials. This site changes. Lots of good reference documents here, a vetted source that we use routinely. So here I've got some questions that we use, quick questions when we're out auditing and thinking about environmental health and safety management systems to sort of evaluate what's the safety culture looking like here, what's the breadth and depth of it. And I suggest you take some time to answer these questions for your own institution and have some conversations about them and see what they uncover. There may be some bumps and warts that you hadn't known about. And really you could hopefully can take some pride in some things that are actually functioning, maybe not formally, but at that really all-important sub-level. The first one we talk about for the research arm really would be to ask the PIs and laboratory management, who may in fact be more intimately involved in the day-to-day activities of the lab, how are you involved in environmental health and safety? And then just stop talking and see what kind of answers you get. They're going to run the gamut. We review the organizational charts and ask our clients, how visible do you think environmental health and safety is in the reporting structure? We've seen all manner of reporting structures for environmental health and safety, up through a research division or through facilities or through, pure risk management. I wouldn't say there's absolutely a right way to do this, or that there's one way that's definitely better than the others. But I can say that the higher up the chain EHS folks report definitely translates into some support, visibility, funding, and such. Then we ask, what EHS committees exist and how well do they function? Is it people getting together? Like, are they, putting anything out? What does their charter look like? What have they been charged with? Who gets invited to those meetings? We'll review the minutes and of these meetings and examine the deliverables to see how much impact they're having. I can tell you that for my higher ed clients, when they have well-functioning, targeted committees, they can really be a savior for just frankly an understaffed higher ed EHS department. And then lastly, and I promised Barry I wouldn't stump on this one too hard, are instructors incorporating EHS into the curriculum? As Barry mentioned earlier, the students are not covered by federal OSHA. The instructor in the classroom is, the PI in the lab is, but not the undergraduate student. Mm-hmm. And so, looking, it's a huge compliance gap. So I feel at a moral level, we have an absolute obligation to incorporate health and safety into the curriculum wherever we can. And there's been some really creative ways that folks have done that with our clients. For this next generation, our professors asking students to read the safety data sheets for the chemicals they're using before an experiment. How much safety training are they given before each lab exercise? Or was it sort of this one safety review at the beginning of the semester and now it's over? Do they have to summarize the safety precautions that were taken in their lab reports? And since students like to collect points, what would it say to a student to have a health and safety question on a quiz or an exam? I mean, that's the ultimate, value placement on health and safety. You're going to get credit for knowing this. So those are some good questions on to start with for health and safety culture assessments. So the hazard determination and risk assessment process is so super important. It really gets us back to our mission as health and safety professionals to anticipate, recognize, and control hazards. It is absolutely a critical cog in making sure you have a healthy and safe work environment. So, and it goes as a two-way street. And I want to make sure that we understand that principal investigators and instructors cannot be left alone to figure this out exclusively, nor can PIs really just throw their hands up and rely solely on EHS to cover all the reviews of all the interesting things going on in their labs. There's got to be a dialogue on these risk assessments so that EHS folks know what knowledge-based researchers have regarding health and safety, and PIs know what resources are available to them. And, I think in the higher ed labs, we give all kinds of credit to, our doctoral trained scientists who are really great at doing science, maybe in some respects not thinking all the way through some of the health and safety aspects. And I've got to share a war story here about an audit we did a number of years ago with hydrofluoric acid. And this was in a research lab. It was in a commercial research lab, so maybe some of the higher ed folks can take some solace in the fact these things happen in industry as well as in higher ed. But we had a client, my partner and I were out doing some audits. We knew that some HF use, some hydrofluoric acid use was going on in the lab. Just to get everyone on the same page, hydrofluoric acid is a particularly hazardous acid. It'll burn your skin for sure, but that's the least of your problems. It will chelate to calcium and essentially dissolve your bones. So it'll dissolve your skeleton from the inside out. So HF we take very seriously. There's an antidote that you should have around, calcium gluconate. It's a gel, in case of an emergency and or exposure. So we were doing an audit in this lab. My partner and I went over to the jar of calcium gluconate, to make sure he had it. And we opened it up, and oh my gosh, 2/3 of it is gone. So we were instantly concerned. So we went to the principal investigator and said, oh my gosh, 2/3 of this bottle is gone. What happened? There was no reports of an exposure incident. And he said, oh, don't worry. I put that stuff all over my face when I'm using HF so that I don't have to wear a face shield. Okay. So a little bit of knowledge could be a dangerous thing. So we've got, and that was, doctoral trained scientist with 15 years of experience. So we've got to have that boots on the ground, give and take, where researchers can feel comfortable collaborating with EHS to get their risk assessments done.
Shannon, in some of these labs, are there other chemicals that you've seen come up in the teaching lab that have potentially problematic that people should be sensitive to?
Sure. And I'm glad you said teaching lab, because we sort of been focused on the research labs. Health and safety professionals have got an obligation to make sure we're doing nothing hazardous in the teaching labs. So I think we probably all could agree that in the teaching labs, we really should be taking every opportunity to eliminate or substitute hazards. In a teaching environment, there's a number of ways to demonstrate things. In the research lab, there's a couple of heavy hitters besides HF. So, that you'd want special controls for, maybe perchloric acid, where you'd need special kinds of hoods and washdown systems. Anything that would trigger an OSHA expanded standard. Methylene chloride, you've got to do special training for that, some of the other carcinogens. I would say probably the focus on the OSHA expanded standards would be the ones that would trigger those special reviews. But also want to make sure we're not forgetting the undergraduate teaching labs, making sure we're having a look at those syllabi and making sure nothing serious is going on there. Standard operating procedures are super important, as they're a critical part of developing the safety culture to see how well developed the SOPs are. In the more recent tragic laboratory injuries and fatalities we all know about around the country, root cause analyses have identified either a lack of existing SOPs or individuals not following existing SOPs, either because they weren't completely unaware of them or they were taking shortcuts. So, the SOPs as a written set of tasks are going to incorporate the hazard identification and the risk mitigation into them and in one nugget. Certainly, you're going to get the pushback. It's easy to do SOPs for fairly routine tasks where you've got some risk, but it really does not let you off the hook for getting SOPs written for some of the smaller, more hazardous things. That's generally where folks are taking more risk. So, at a higher level, we also ask our clients, how good is your chemical hygiene plan? Were you involved in putting it together? When was the last time it was reviewed? How well is it implemented? Do you do self-audits to check that folks are using the SOPs, they're trained on them? Keeping them up to date is really important. The PPE assessments I put up there, it is a common, one of the top 5 common citables. It's funny, PPE assessments are a funny thing. They're a very small piece of a risk assessment process. Ideally we would be eliminating, substituting, engineering out, and administratively controlling hazards before we relied on PPE. But they're a large compliance gap. And the process of completing a PPE is so important because the statute does dictate that it has to be lab specific, it's got to be written down, it has to be certified by a competent individual. So it forces that interaction with EHS and researchers. It's an awesome opportunity for EHS and researchers to begin collaborating with each other. The interesting thing here too is these again, as one of the top citations, they can issue them per individual, so those fines add up very quickly. But looping that back to safety culture, this is one of the great areas in which you can have, in which the statute requires that collaboration. There's another link down here. This is to the OSHA library. I'm not sure how often folks use these. We use them all the time. They're great documents there. The PPE assessments library page has fantastic checklists on it. It doesn't have a ton of pictograms. There's a lot of PPE assessment forms out there. You can just Google it and grab one. And you folks in higher ed are so good about sharing tools. This is a series of checklists would be great in helping benchmark any forms you've already got or developing your own. Okay, so moving on to another critical piece of the risk management puzzle is just a well-functioning near-miss and incident reporting system. If you are not reporting and evaluating near misses, you can't prevent the incidents. So I think we're all familiar with Heinrich's triangle of unsafe acts, near misses, minor injuries, and serious injuries and fatalities, whereby, for every 3,000 unsafe acts, we've got 300 near misses, 29 minor injuries, and that preventing that one serious injury or fatality. So, when you look at it, ostensibly you have 3,000 chances to prevent a fatality on your campus, and let's make sure we're taking them. The investigation and resolution of near misses is one of our best leading indicators of health and safety performance. We're always looking for those leading indicators in our health and safety management systems. So these, I get it, there's serious challenges in higher ed to making this happen. Operations are very diffuse. You may have 2 or 3 people in a lab in a corner of a campus no one gets to. But the workforces are constantly in flux. Every 12 months, you may have different people in and out of a lab. There are off-campus activities going on and training opportunities for students EHS people might not even know about. We've got some higher ed clients who are in the healthcare education industry. They've got externships where folks are going out and running vaccination clinics and blood draw clinics and things like this. And we're just trying to get a handle on needle sticks, So just, I get it. There's serious challenges, and I think for probably more so than any other industry we work in, there's serious cultural and language barriers. So there are certain cultures where the party line is everything's fine, everything's great. We got this, no problems here ever, until you go out for drinks in the evening when they really talk about business. But I'm telling you that you got to hit that one straight on. There can't be that culture of blame. You've got to broach the cultural issues head on and get folks to start reporting. After you've got the reporting working, having a really good system to determine root cause analyses so that corrective and preventive actions can be taken. This is a great nugget for well-functioning health and safety committee. There's another health and safety link there. This one's to the National Safety Council. This is just a short piece, just 2-3 pages on the importance of near-miss reporting systems. But what I really liked about this one, there was just a great couple bullets on how to encourage employees to participate and report, and it outlined some of the educational things you can do, how to recognize reporting, and how to really highlight the closeouts. So that was just a nice short piece that I'd encourage you to read.
Shannon, for that, is that a component of your chemical hygiene plan, the near-miss reporting, or is it?
Not traditionally. It tends to be a standalone
Program?
piece. Yeah, that requires attention. Absolutely.
All right.
So for my last bullet, chemical management as a nugget, and so this applies to the chemistry labs primarily, but also the biology labs. We tend to kind of look over them, but they've got some maybe not as much chemical use as chemistry labs, but some serious hazards there as well. And this is where Barry and I tend to talk, about the most and shake our heads and go, wow, this is the Wild West sometimes. And I have encouraged and pushed and thumped my drum for two things for chemical management with my clients. Do you have a good chemical procurement policy? And do you insist on regular chemical inventories? Mm-hmm. And to that end, what does the policy cover? It should cover chemicals certainly brought onto the campus, but also what's synthesized in the lab. So we've got to make sure we're not losing sight of that as well. The policy is an opportunity to introduce a review, authorization, a control process. What's the security value of that? Making sure folks know their purchases are being reviewed. One size isn't going to fit all for a procurement policy. There's large institutions, small institutions. There are just some things that are going to just never go away, might die with the researcher like a purchase card. Researchers aren't going to want to let go of that control of being able to get something, tomorrow. I get it, but just the goal is to know what's coming on campus, perhaps what's leaving, and what's being made within its walls. Super important. There's lots of advantages to a tight chemical procurement policy and routine inventorying. Inventorying is hard. A lot of our pharma clients, they have sophisticated systems where they barcode in and barcode out, so at any minute they know what their chemical inventory is. And I get it, that might not work for higher ed, some of our higher ed clients, although I do have some that are doing that, which is great. But, a central purchasing system allows so many benefits. You can negotiate volume pricing for some of the heavy use clients. It's going to ensure compliance with federal and state reporting requirements for certain volumes of things. It allows for a review of chemicals being brought on campus to make sure you can comply. Again, like Barry had mentioned, there's just some chemicals that have an OSHA expanded standard. If I've got methylene and chloride on site, I got to know where it is, who's using it, what are the volumes. I got to get my negative exposure assessment done. I got to do additional training. Making sure that those things are shored up too. As far as the chemical inventorying, it allows for some really important things, chemical adoption. So, good old-fashioned, can I borrow a cup of sugar? So Lab X is going to know that Lab Y bought dimethyl expensive last month, and can I go borrow a gram? Getting that central source available, central inventory is important. It's going to help with security. It's going to certainly help with emergency first responder planning. The first responders have got to know where you've got your chemicals and how much you've got. They got to plan for emergencies, and certainly with waste disposal planning, which Barry's going to talk about in here. I mean, I could go on with more war stories on chemical procurement, and you wouldn't believe what we've seen, but it's definitely worth spending some risk mitigation time on. So in summary, here are my top 5 suggestions, as Barry had wanted. Review that American Chemical Society page. There's great content in there. There's also great teaching content in there. You can direct instructors and PIs to get that into the curriculum. Working on positive EHS engagement on campus whenever and wherever possible. Insert yourselves. Boots on the ground. I have chemical hygiene officers who routinely go to department meetings and say, hey, how you doing? Just to hear what's going on. Friendly face. Those kinds of activities. Getting your risk assessments done in the lab. Can't stress how important that is enough. Making sure you're implementing and harnessing the data from a robust near-miss system. and reviewing existing or implementing new procurement policies will get you a long way.
Okay.
Thank
Terrific.
you, Barry. Yeah,
Well,
I'll turn it
Shannon.
over.
Thank you. My focus here is on waste management in the higher ed science lab, and for that, we look at the Hazardous Waste Management Regulatory Program. There are federal and state legal obligations to characterize waste materials and then properly store them prior to off-site disposal. And for that, we're looking at the federal law known as the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, or RCRA. And so it begins with the federal program. The law was passed in 1976. Regulations came out in the mid-1980s. And this program essentially has been delegated to the state. Each state has to have at least a program that's as stringent as the federal, but a state can be more stringent. And for instance, here in New York includes PCB waste among the wastes which are regulated as hazardous waste. Now, EPA, back at the December 1999, had an enforcement initiative that sort of targeted higher ed education, higher ed institutions. The record regulations really were designed for the manufacturing setting, but EPA looked at higher ed and noted that in terms of exposure and the amount of hazardous waste generated, it was significant. And so they urged colleges and universities to review their compliance programs and, if necessary, to take advantage of EPA's audit policy. There were a series of inspections, there were fines, a number of colleges and universities entered into agreements pursuant to which they conducted audits of their facility. And one of the big focuses really was on the science laboratories and how hazardous waste was managed in those labs. EPA has a lot of good guidance documents, and Shannon was making reference to the number of OSHA documents. I would refer you to RCRA Online, and going through that on the web, you can find many EPA past letters and guidance documents. In this one situation here, going into full text search and putting in hazardous waste generating laboratories should pull up as the first item an EPA memo dated August 16, 2002, which gives some very good information and guidance for a range of hazardous waste management issues that are encountered in the laboratories. For instance, one of the issues that comes up is who may determine whether or not a particular waste is hazardous. That question is answered in this particular guidance document, in which it says that the hazardous waste determination is not limited to the individual who actually produces a solid waste. For example, environmental health and safety personnel may make a hazardous waste determination for a waste produced by an individual researcher as long as the EHS personnel and the researcher are part of the same person, that is part of that academic institution. So I invite you to take a look at that just for not only these issues of characterization, but for a number of other issues that come up in the lab. Now we focused, of course, initially on solid waste, whether or not materials we're dealing with, when have they moved from virgin in process but are now solid waste. That is waste which are discarded, abandoned, recycled, inherently waste-like. Odd term, and I think EPA probably was focused on a term such as that when they looked at a number of these science labs and some storage facilities, where they would walk into those storage labs and see beakers which maybe have got cobwebs, maybe there's some bubbling that has kind of gone off and left some stains. And the suggestion is this material really isn't being used anymore and is waste-like and really should have worked its way now to off-site disposal. Now, solid waste can be a solid, liquid, or containerized gas. And to get down to the details, to be a hazardous waste, that solid waste must exhibit a characteristic of hazardous waste or appear on one of the lists of hazardous waste in the regulations. And here are the hazardous waste characteristics. For ignitability, corrosivity, pretty straightforward in terms of what that means. Reactivity, that's a narrative description. And so a solid waste exhibits the characteristic of reactivity. If a representative sample, for example, is normally unstable and readily undergoes violent change without detonating, it reacts violently with water, it forms potential explosive mixtures with water, etc., etc. A list of 8 items. Toxicity. This is the process whereby one determines whether or not this particular material, after it goes through what is referred to as the toxic chemical leaching protocol, still retains a certain level of certain toxic constituents. And if so, it's considered to be a hazardous waste and, for purposes of having a characteristic. And once a solid waste exhibits one or more of these characteristics, it's regulated as hazardous waste so long as it has that characteristic. There are also listed hazardous waste. You'll hear the categories of F listed. Oftentimes you see that as spent solvents. U listed. This could be your virgin product that you're no longer using and no longer have a need for. And now it's the point where it's intended to be discarded. Among these listed wastes, there are another category called acute hazardous waste. These are your real heavy hitters in terms of concerns of toxicity. And you can see a certain number of them are F and more under the U listed. And it's important to know if you're dealing with acute hazardous waste because one is considered to be a large quantity generator if one has as little as 2.2 pounds or 1 kilogram of acute hazardous waste. Otherwise, you could be, depending upon the amount of hazardous waste you have, 1,000 kilograms or 2,200 pounds, you would be in the category of large quantity if you exceed those numbers. In New York State, listed wastes include PCB waste, as I noted before. And stepping back again, as we'll see here as we move into temporary storage in the lab, these rules will apply for large quantity generator and small quantity generators of hazardous waste. And a generator, a large quantity generator, small quantity generator, may accumulate as much as 55 gallons of hazardous waste or 1 quart of acutely hazardous waste, these are your threshold amounts, in containers, and this is the key set of phrases, at or near any point of generation where the waste were initially accumulated, which is under the control of the operator of the process. And then certain requirements for that generator. There are container requirements, need to comply with those. The citation here in New York is on your PowerPoint. And you have to mark those containers with the words hazardous waste and with other words that identify the contents of the containers and to give the person handling those containers a clue more specifically in terms of what they may be dealing with. The area where the waste materials are being temporarily stored is known as a satellite accumulation area. Now, a facility can have multiple SAAs, but hazardous waste cannot be moved from one SAA to another. The regulations do not limit the number of hazardous waste that you can have in a satellite accumulation area or even the number of containers that can be placed in an SAA. Now, again, that is what the regulation requires. It may be from a health and safety perspective that maybe you don't want to put certain hazardous waste next to one another because of concerns one might have in terms of coming into contact. But as far as the regulations are concerned, they are limiting really only the total volume of the waste that can be put in that particular SAA. 55 gallons of hazardous waste or 1 quart of acute hazardous waste.
Barry, I'm going to stop you here because I've seen certain situations, and again, this is not my area of expertise, but you'll have a hallway of laboratories, 4 or 5 laboratories, maybe doing the same things, all chemistry, and they'll have one satellite accumulation area, and they're sort of thinking as well, it's one area, it's consolidated. Why? Help us understand why that doesn't meet the intention of the regulation.
Well, again, it goes back to the definition. It's got to be supposedly near the person who generated the waste and under that person's control. So as you start moving further away, and we go here to our next slide, EPA has sort of touched upon that, in which they say, you can move or consolidate waste within that satellite accumulation area as long as it's at or near the point of generation, under the control of the operator. And to your point specifically, EPA was asked, could you give us a little bit more guidance in terms of how far down that hallway we can still have the same SAA? And they addressed it, as the agency did, right on by saying it's not possible for us to really give you any guidance. But that was an issue in the course of these inspections that the agency conducted during their audit, their enforcement initiative, right to that point. And so it's going to be a case-by-case situation as to if it's too far so that the person no longer is in control, really, of that particular material. So if it goes down a couple of classrooms, obviously, I think it's going to be problematic.
Right.
So now, satellite accumulation containers should not be marked with a date unless the amount of hazardous waste in the area has exceeded one of those threshold amounts. And then once you've exceeded it, you have to mark it with that date, because you are now on the clock in terms of when you've got to now get that excess out of that satellite accumulation area and off to your centralized hazardous waste storage area, getting ready to go offsite for disposal. So the key is, obviously, people should be watching these areas, because you'd like to get those off before you hit the threshold, before you go on the clock. And the clock is a 3-day clock, that once you exceed that threshold amount, you have up to 3 days to kind of move the excess to that centralized hazardous waste storage area. So that is 3 consecutive days. That's not 3 business days, 3 working days. So again, in terms of being active in terms of the management of your containers, keeping a look in terms of how much you're generating, so you don't have to fall within that potential 3-day period and now you're scrambling when you got a holiday, a weekend, or that sort of thing. Because if you don't remove it within the 3 days, technically that satellite accumulation area becomes a hazardous waste storage area. Again, depending upon whether or not you're a large quantity or a small quantity generator, this is we get into more sophisticated management responsibilities. Now, there are container requirements, as noted. Series of them here. They've got to be, as referenced earlier, at or near the point where the waste was generated. They're supposed to be in good condition, not in danger of leaking. Again, you're managing these areas so that you can see if something's leaking, so you can then transfer something to a container that's not leaking, or get it off to the centralized area for management. Additional requirements here, that container should be compatible with the hazardous waste that you're storing. Again, key requirement here, marking with the words hazardous waste with a description, keeping them closed except when you're adding or removing waste, and you're handling them so you're not doing things that could in fact rupture those containers or cause them to leak. Back again to our RECRA Online. I would invite you to go to RECRA Online and type in satellite accumulation areas in the full text search, and there's one particular memo, EPA memo, entitled Frequently Asked Questions About Satellite Accumulation Areas. And there are a number of great questions there in terms of scenarios that oftentimes come up. I'll just select one, which is question 14 in that particular guidance memo. It says if a facility has very small containers, vials or tubes of hazardous waste that are too small to label with the words hazardous waste or other words that identify the contents of the container, again, the key word is the regulation, how should the containers be labeled? Answer. Generally, we would expect the small containers to be placed in properly labeled larger containers, which would have the added benefit of secondary containment should the small containers break. However, other approaches that would achieve the same result also be acceptable. So go to that memo, a lot of other good Q&A that I think identify scenarios that you'll encounter in the lab. Here are my top 5 areas of waste management concern in the higher ed science lab. First one is failure to identify the point in time when the waste is considered to be, a material is considered to be a waste. This is what EPA sort of focused on in their inspections of academic facilities, and that is this indefinite storage of working materials, that the researcher just couldn't get himself or herself to decide that I don't need this anymore, it should be considered a waste and taken off-site for disposal. And some of the scary things that EPA encounters going into these storage containers or lockers and seeing sort of a range of different materials which were considered to be working materials, but upon closer examination really should have been characterized as waste. Then you need to characterize those materials as hazardous. You need to go through that process, look at whether it has a characteristic or it's on a list. You have to put that waste material in the satellite accumulation area. Once it's a waste material, it doesn't just stay at your workstation. It finds its way to that satellite accumulation area. You have to properly maintain those containers. There's a list of those requirements that were referenced there in an earlier slide. And then, once you exceed the threshold, they got to be moved. We start the process now of taking this material off-site for disposal. Now, EPA recognized that, yes, a lot of these rules we put together, we had manufacturing facilities in mind, and so we understand that academic laboratories sometimes represent certain unique situations. Now, we still want to be mindful of how we manage hazardous waste, but they came up with a specific rule tailored for academic laboratories, and that rule was promulgated on December 1, 2008, and there on your slide you see the reference in the Federal Register, and the link there, it identifies the description of what these terms and conditions of this rule are. If an academic facility does not want to opt into this rule, they have to continue to be subject to the pre-existing generator standards. This is a list of the various advantages to the EPA rule. Going online and looking at the EPA brochure, which details some of those advantages, is something that I think you may want to in fact consider. That EPA rule is not effective in New York State. The citation there indicates where and which states have in fact adopted that rule. New York is considering picking up on that rule and checking with contacts here in the New York State DEC. This was mid-September. Been advised that their academic lab rule has been sent to the Governor's Office of Regulatory Reform for review and approval to release for public comment. They were hopeful that that rule would be released soon from Gore, and following release, the regulations would then go out for formal comment. Once released, it's estimated that they could go into effect maybe in about a year. So again, until then, we are dealing just with the existing rules and the regulations for generators. And if you're in some of those states, though, that have adopted this rule, because the states had to take the formal step to, in fact, pick up on that rule, you have another option. So what are my top 5 suggestions to maximize safety and minimize risk with waste management? First one is creating and maintaining a site-specific waste management program that establishes a clear chain of command. So who is responsible within that laboratory for those SAAs? And who then, once we have those wastes, that coordinates compliance within the laboratory and then coordinates with EHS staff to get that material out of the SAA and on its way to a centralized storage area for off-site disposal. You want in this waste management program a system of accountability that encourages feedback. Similar to what Shannon was talking about in terms of just health and safety. This works when people talk, they collaborate, and people are encouraged to give feedback in terms of what's working and what's not working. Clearly, one size does not fit all, and so each facility has got to make its own judgments in terms of how best to, in fact, work it for their facility. Monitor, and to the extent possible, minimize the types of quantities of virgin lab materials that at some point in their life in that lab, they will be considered to be solid waste. Shannon made the distinction between teaching labs and research labs. Obviously, in the teaching labs, to the extent to which you can minimize those lab materials that could be problematic is ideal, because you're probably in that setting dealing with students who are least sophisticated in terms of handling those type of materials. And so, but be upfront, and this requires some thinking in terms of ahead of time what materials we should introduce into the lab. Exploring again the advantage of a centralized purchasing system. Again, you have X amount which is purchased again for a teaching lab, and maybe lab A needs some materials and lab B over subscribed, if you will, so the labs can talk and sort of minimize amongst them just how they can get what they need and not be generating a lot of material, which then would have to be handled as waste materials. Again, a point that Shannon made in terms of training for student lab training, including a waste management component. So obviously we're looking at your safety data sheets, health and safety concerns, how should I be handling this material in the course of my working with it. But then at the end, thinking about what do I do at the end? What do I do when I know this is now a waste material? How do I dispose of it? Do I dispose of it in the lab in terms of, is it aqueous materials within the rules that allow that, or is it something that should find its way into a cellular accumulation area? And I like the idea, Shannon, you talked about making it a part of some quiz or a test and say, what is your understanding in terms of how you deal with this material? Do you look for help when you get to the point of your experiment in terms of this material is now considered waste? What do I do with it next? Is that something that you think about even before you start? What is the end point to this process?
I think the community is ripe for this kind of thing. Students are so focused on sustainability issues and life cycle analyses, and really understanding they're going to do this experiment, they're going to learn from it, but have real an appreciation of what happens to that stuff when I'm done. Who's going to have to handle it, and how could they be affected? Where is it going to go in the environment? How much is it going to cost to get rid of this stuff?
Correct.
The whole, I think the picture fits nicely in the curriculum, and I think that it's the right time, it's the right age for these things.
And then so they then learn, because of this training, just what are the characteristics that are problematic? Is this material which is potentially ignitable? Is this corrosive material? So they start thinking about those things. So that helps not only for ultimate disposal, but obviously as they're dealing with that material for health and safety. And so we have a number of researchers, who go out and they make their pitch to do something exciting, and oftentimes they forget to include this component for waste management. And again, going to the research side of the lab, that's when you get the more exotics. So for the academic institution, sometimes the end game for that research project can be a waste material, which is problematic in terms of managing, in terms of cost for off-site disposal. And again, this is another great way in which an opportunity for collaboration, dealing with the people in the lab, with the EHS staff, in terms of how do we handle this? Because I know at the end of the day, I'm going to have X amount of materials, and you get some sort of a ballpark in terms of how much is it going to cost to go off-site. And again, maybe you talk then, maybe I should use some different materials. I can get the same end game, and I can minimize the cost, minimize the risk. The last item here, which is probably the most important, is auditing. And nobody likes looking over somebody else's shoulder, and this is why it's important really for it to be more of a collaborative process rather than a command and control scenario. But it's very important to, in fact, review and get some feedback about whatever plans you have, which are in place to ensure legal compliance or maintain, or maintain your best management practices. You want someone looking over your shoulders, an EHS going and doing it. You don't want that audit, if you will, being conducted by a regulatory agency, because obviously that just puts it on a higher level of stress. And the end game here is not necessarily, I mean, you do want to make sure you're in compliance, but you want to be able to handle these sort of issues in-house.
Yeah.
And so if you have a program like that, plus if the regulator does come in, one of the things that the inspector wants to know is that, has this been audited? And in fact, things happen. But if you have a program and the program is audited, and in this particular time someone forgot to characterize that waste, that particular waste was not labeled, but look, we've been doing this now for a long time, and we have a regular program, perhaps the regulator would say, fine, we'll let this one go, because we know you're trying to do it.
Yeah. And Barry, I'll tell you, in some of the places that I've been where safety culture is really on top of the game, people will audit each other.
And that's perfect.
So,
right.
Internal audit.
So that would then bring us to questions, and I don't know if we have any questions, but currently, if you don't have any specific question right now, we have here in our last slide, our email addresses. So please send your questions to either myself or to Shannon, dealing with these issues that we've discussed, both health and safety and its companion here, waste management, for that material once it's no longer being used and going off-site for disposal. So, Shannon, any additional thoughts or comments, relative to our program?
No, I think we're good. Happy to answer questions. I think both of our websites are up there too. You can see what we do, and the webinar will be posted. If there's colleagues that you have that want to look at it at a future time, I think it'll be on the BSK website.
Exactly.
Yep. Great.
So we thank you all for attending this webinar, and look forward perhaps to speaking with you in the near future. Thank you so much.
Okay, done.
Over.
All done.
50 cents.
That was good.
Yeah, it was.
And the only questions were there is, can I get a copy?
Oh.
I don't have any sound, and the slides aren't advancing. Okay, and I said, just do a refresh.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's what you're doing?
We had 30 people, so, if 2 people say my slides aren't advancing, I know it's not an issue on our end.
Everyone, right.
And one person says, I have no sound, again, not an issue on our end. So,
Okay.
yeah.
And you say 30 people, you have 30 connections, right?
Yes.
Right.
So 2 people might be